Human cadet faces the galaxy's most dangerous fighter, she smirked. I'm not afraid. Announcement board lit up with bright red letters. And every cadet in the Galactic Military Academy stopped what they were doing to look at the screen that hung above the main training hall on Station Verith 7. A massive orbital facility where the best warriors from 12 star systems came to prove themselves worthy of commanding fleets and leading armies. Across the known galaxy, Cadet Yun Xiao Yan stood among her fellow humans. 7 of them in total. The first human cohort ever admitted to this prestigious academy were species that had traveled between stars for thousands of years, sent their children to become legends. She was 22 years old, born in a small village in the Korean peninsula on Earth, and she stood at barely 160 centimeters tall, which made her smaller than almost every other species in the academy except for the insect-like Vrelians who preferred to float rather than walk the combat trials, were the most important event of the academy year. And every cadet knew that their performance in these trials would determine their future assignments, their rankings among their peers, and most importantly, the reputation of their entire species in the eyes of the galactic community. Random match assignments will now be displayed. The automated voice announced through speakers that echoed in every corridor of the massive station. Names began to appear on the screen, pairing cadets from different species against each other in what would be one-on-one combat matches held over the next 3 days in the Grand Combat Arena. Xiu Yan watched as her classmates received their assignments, some breathing sighs of relief when they drew opponents they believed they could defeat, others growing pale when they saw they would face warriors from species known for their combat prowess. When her name finally appeared, the entire hall fell silent. Cadet Yun Xiao Yan of Earth, the screen displayed, matched against Rakthos the Unbroken of Kovan Prime. A collective gasp echoed through the training hall, and Xiao Yan felt the eyes of hundreds of cadets turn toward her with expressions that ranged from pity to morbid curiosity. To Vaktos, the Unbroken was not just any Corvani warrior. He was the most feared fighter in the entire academy and possibly in the entire galaxy. A creature who had never lost a single match in 47 years of competition across dozens of worlds and hundreds of opponents. The Corvani were the apex predators of the known universe, standing 3 meters tall with 4 powerful arms, scales that could deflect most weapons, and claws that could tear through starship hulls. They had been bred for war over millions of years of evolution on a planet where everything was trying to kill everything else. Himself had killed 17 opponents in what were supposed to be non-lethal training matches, and each time the deaths had been ruled acceptable combat outcomes because the Corvani were simply too valuable as allies for the Galactic Council to punish. Park Jin-woo, one of Xiao Yan's fellow human cadets, grabbed her arm with a trembling hand and whispered, "You have to withdraw. There is no shame in it. Everyone will understand." But Xiao Yan did not respond immediately. Instead, she continued to stare at the screen where her fate had been sealed by a random algorithm that did not care whether she lived or died within an hour. The news had spread across the entire station, and people Xiao Yan had never met began approaching her with words of sympathy as if she had already died. The academy instructors were the first to offer her an official way out, suggesting that she could claim an equipment malfunction or a sudden illness that would allow her to withdraw without losing face. "We understand that humans are new to galactic society," Instructor Velrith, a tall reptilian Sethian, said with what he probably thought was kindness in his voice. "And there is no need to prove anything by dying needlessly against an opponent you cannot possibly defeat." Xiao Yan thanked him politely but refused the next day. A formal message arrived from the Corvani ambassador himself, a document written in the most diplomatic language possible that essentially said humans were not yet ready for the full rigors of galactic military competition, and that no one would think less of them if they chose to sit this one out. Seo Yan deleted the message without responding her. Human classmates gathered in her quarters that night, their faces showing the fear they felt for their friend and comrade, who seemed determined to walk into her own death. "Why are you doing this?" Jinwoo demanded, his voice cracking with emotion as he paced back and forth across her small room. "You do not have to prove anything to these aliens who have looked down on us since the day we arrived." Seo Yan sat calmly on her bunk, cleaning her standard issue training knife with slow and deliberate movements, while she considered how to explain something that she felt in her bones but struggled to put into words. "My grandmother," she finally said, "survived the war when she was just a child. And then she survived the famine that came after. And then she survived the occupation that lasted for decades. She never ran from anything in her entire life. And when she died at 93 years old, she told me that the only thing worse than losing is not fighting at all." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. "I will not be the human who ran," Seo Yan continued. "I will not be the reason they think we are weak. I will not dishonor everything my grandmother survived by running away from one Kavani, no matter how big or how scary he is." The next morning, Yuza Yin received a summons that surprised everyone. Vrakthos himself had requested a meeting with her before their match, something he had never done with any opponent in his entire career. She found him waiting in one of the private training rooms, his massive form blocking out the light from the overhead panels as he stood with all four arms crossed over his armored chest. He was even more terrifying up close than she had imagined, with scales that shimmered like dark metal and eyes that had watched countless opponents die at his hands. "So you are the human who refuses to withdraw," he rumbled, his voice so deep that Seo Yin felt it vibrate in her chest. "I wanted to see what kind of creature would be so foolish as to think it could stand against me." He leaned down until his massive head was level with hers, his breath hot against her face as he studied her with those predator eyes that had never known what it meant to be prey. "Do you understand that you will die, little human?" he asked. "Do you understand that I will break every bone in your tiny body and leave you bleeding on the arena floor while your species watches and learns their place in this galaxy?" Seo Yan looked up at him, this mountain of muscle and scale and death that towered over her like a nightmare made flesh. And she felt her lips curve into a smirk that seemed to confuse him more than anything else she could have done. "I am not afraid," she said simply. Vrakthos stared at her for a long moment, and something flickered in his eyes that might have been surprise or might have been the first hint of respect. "Then you are either very brave or very stupid," he finally said. "Either way, I look forward to finding out which." He turned and walked away, leaving Seo Yan alone in the training room with her smirk still in place and her heart pounding in her chest. But not from fear, from anticipation. The match was in 3 days, and she had work to do. Word spread across Station Varasemen faster than light itself could travel, and by the end of the first day after the match announcement, every being on the station knew about the human cadet who had refused to withdraw against Vrakthos the Unbroken, the gambling houses that operated in the lower levels of the station, where cadets and officers alike went to spend their credits on entertainment and vice. Opened betting markets for the upcoming match almost immediately. The odds were 200 to 1 against Seo Yan surviving the fight, and some of the more creative bookmakers were offering side bets on how long she would last before Vrakthos killed her. Most people were putting their money on less than 2 minutes. Seo Yan ignored all of this noise and focused on what she could control, which was her preparation for the fight that would either make her a legend or another forgotten casualty in the long history of species who had tried and failed to prove themselves against the galaxy's apex. Predators, she spent her first day of preparation in the Academy archives, accessing every recording of every fight Rakdos had ever participated in during his 47 years of undefeated combat. There were hundreds of recordings, and she watched them all with the same intense focus her grandmother had used when teaching her to read the subtle movements of the wind. Through rice fields, the Corvani fought like living avalanches, using their forearms to attack from multiple angles simultaneously, while their armored scales deflected any counterattacks that somehow managed to land. Rakdos was even worse than his species' norm. He was faster than he should have been for his size, more precise with his strikes, and possessed a cruelty that seemed to enjoy prolonging his opponents' suffering rather than ending fights quickly. But as Seo Yeon watched recording after recording, she began to notice something that others might have missed. That Rakdos was arrogant in a very specific way. He relied so completely on his overwhelming strength and natural armor that he had never needed to develop true defensive skills. He toyed with weaker opponents because he had never faced anyone who could actually hurt him. He was, in his own way, predictable. On the second day, an unexpected visitor came to the small training room where Seo Yin had been practicing her footwork and evasion techniques for hours without rest. Counselor Mirith was of the Sari, a species that looked like graceful humanoids made of flowing silver liquid, and they were known throughout the galaxy as pacifists who refused to engage in any form of violence. The Sari were also known as the greatest strategic minds in the known universe, their physical weakness having forced them to develop their intellects to levels that other species could barely comprehend. "I have been watching you, young human," Mirith said, in a voice that sounded like wind chimes singing in a gentle breeze. "And I see something in you that I have not seen in a very long time." Seo Yin stopped their training and bowed respectfully to the elderly counselor, who had taught strategic theory to cadets for longer than humanity had possessed the ability to travel between stars. "You see a human who is about to die," Seo Yeon replied. "That is what everyone sees when they look at me now." Mirith made a sound that might have been laughter if the Dasari laughed. "No, child, I see a human who is looking for a way to win. And that is far more interesting than watching someone prepare to die. Tell me, have you found anything useful in your research?" Seo Yeon hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to trust this alien who had approached her without warning. But something in Mirith's silver eyes told her that the counselor genuinely wanted to help. "He is arrogant," she said, "and he relies too much on his natural advantages. But even knowing that, I cannot find a way past his scales. My knife cannot cut through them, and I am not strong enough to hurt him with my bare hands." Mirith moved closer, and when they spoke next, their voice had dropped to barely a whisper. "There is knowledge that I am forbidden to share with cadets. Knowledge that could get me expelled from this academy and possibly imprisoned by the Galactic Council. But I am old, and I am tired of watching young warriors with potential die because no one had the courage to give them a fair chance." The Dazari counselor told Seo Yan about a weakness that the Corvani had kept secret for thousands of years, a vulnerability that they had killed to protect and that very few non-Corvani had ever learned. The armored scales that covered a Corvani's body protected them from almost everything. But there were nerve clusters located behind their lower set of arms that were not covered by scales, and a precise strike to those clusters would cause temporary paralysis of the affected limbs. "One strike will not be enough," Mirith warned. "You must hit both lower arms to have any chance of surviving long enough to find another advantage. And he will not make it easy for you. The only time those clusters are exposed is when he raises all four arms to deliver a killing blow." Seo Yeon understood immediately what this meant. She would have to let Rakdos think he had won, let him move in for the kill, and strike in the fraction of a second before his blow landed. It was a plan that had almost no margin for error. But it was a plan, and that was more than she had possessed an hour ago, that night. Her fellow human cadets gathered in her quarters once again. But this time, they came not to convince her to withdraw, but to help her train. Park Jin-woo had spent hours programming training drones to move like Kalvani warriors. Using all the recordings, So-yoon had studied to create the most accurate simulation possible. The other cadets took turns attacking her from multiple angles, forcing her to practice evading strikes from forearms while looking for openings that lasted only milliseconds. They trained until their bodies ached and their minds grew fuzzy with exhaustion. But none of them complained because they understood that this was the most important thing any of them had ever done during a short break. Jin-woo sat beside Seo-yeon and admitted something that had been weighing on him since the match was announced. "I am terrified for you," he said quietly. "I have never been more scared of anything in my life. And I do not know how you can be so calm when you are facing something like this." Seo-yeon thought about his words for a moment. Before responding, "I am not calm," she admitted. "I am terrified too. But fear is not the enemy. Fear is what keeps us sharp and focused. The enemy is letting fear make your decisions for you. Courage is not the absence of fear, Jin-woo. Courage is fighting anyway, on the final day before the match." Rakdos began his psychological warfare in earnest. He sent recordings to Seo-yeon's personal terminal. Footage of his most brutal victories with messages attached that described in graphic detail what he planned to do to her in the arena. He arranged for her to accidentally witness him in one of the training rooms, destroying combat drones with his bare hands while roaring with a fury that shook the walls. Yeon watched his display without showing any reaction. And when he finished and turned to look at her with a predator's grin, she did something that seemed to genuinely confuse him. She sent him a recording of her own, a compilation of human history that showed wars that had killed millions, natural disasters that had nearly wiped out entire civilizations, and the stubborn persistence of a species that had refused to die no matter what the universe threw at them. Her message was simple: "My species does not break." That night, the night before her match, Seo-yeon visited the small garden on the station, where Earth had been given a tiny plot of land to remind human cadets of their home. She knelt in the soil, actual soil from Earth that had been brought across light years of space. And she touched the dirt that had come from Korea, from a village not far from where her grandmother had been born. "I will not let them think we are weak," she whispered to Noah and everyone. "I will show them what humans are made of, grandmother. I promise you that." The Grand Combat Arena was the largest enclosed space on Station Verith 7, a massive dome that could hold over 50,000 spectators and could be programmed to simulate any environment from any planet in the known galaxy. It was configured for standard combat, a flat gray floor with no obstacles or hiding places. Nothing but open space where two warriors would meet, and only one would walk away. Seo-yeon stood in the entrance tunnel that led to the arena floor, listening to the roar of the crowd that had gathered to watch what most of them believed would be a quick and brutal execution. The stands were packed with beings from every corner of the galaxy. News of the match had spread far beyond the academy, and dignitaries, military commanders, and curious civilians had traveled from distant worlds just to witness this moment. Some had come to see Rakdos add another victory to his legendary record. Others had come because they had heard about the human who refused to run, and they wanted to see if there was anything to the rumors about this strange new species from a backwater planet called Earth. Seo-yeon took a deep breath and stepped out of the tunnel into the blinding lights of the arena. The crowd fell. Silent, she walked across the gray floor, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet, and she could feel 50,000 pairs of eyes watching her every movement as she made her way to the center of the arena where the match would begin. She was wearing the standard combat uniform of a human cadet. Lightweight and flexible, designed for speed rather than protection, because humans had never needed to develop armor. They had always relied on other advantages from the opposite tunnel. Rakdos emerged, and the silence was shattered by thunderous applause and cheering from the Kovani supporters who had traveled to see their champion crush another opponent. He was even more massive in the arena lights than he had seen in the training room, his scales gleaming like polished obsidian as he strode toward Descender with the confidence of a predator who had never known defeat. When they stood facing each other, the difference in size was almost comical. Xiao Yian barely reached his chest, and his 4 arms looked thick enough to crush starship bulkheads, while hers looked like they belonged to a child. The referee, a neutral Veloxian whose species was known for their impartiality, floated between them and announced the rules in a voice that carried to every corner of the arena. Combat will continue until one fighter surrenders, is incapacitated, or is killed. Weapons will be provided by the arena. Choose now. A rack of weapons rose from the floor, containing options suitable for various species and fighting styles. Rakdos reached out with his upper right arm and selected a traditional Korvani war axe, a massive curved blade that weighed more than Xiao Yan herself, and that he handled as easily as she might handle a kitchen knife. The crowd roared with approval at his choice as Xiao Yan stepped forward and selected a simple human combat knife, a blade no longer than her forearm that looked like a toy compared to her opponent's weapon. The crowd laughed, and even the referee seemed to hesitate for a moment before asking if she was certain of her choice. "I am certain," she said, and her voice did not waver. The referee floated back to a safe distance and raised one appendage in preparation for the signal to begin. "Fighters ready," the Veloxian announced. "Begin." Rakdos attacked immediately, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for a creature of his size, and his war axe swept through the space where Xiao Yin had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. She had already moved, diving to the side and rolling back to her feet, with the fluid grace of someone who had practiced this exact movement thousands of times. The floor where she had stood was cracked and shattered from the force of his blow, and the crowd gasped at the display of raw power of Rakdos did not pause. He spun and attacked again and again and again, each strike powerful enough to kill her instantly if it connected. Xiao Yin dodged every attack. She did not try to block, did not try to counterattack, did not do anything except move with a speed and precision that gradually silenced the laughter of the crowd for 3 full minutes. She did nothing but evade, studying his movements in real time, just as she had studied them in the recordings, learning the rhythm of his attacks and the tiny tells that preceded each strike of Rakdos. Began to grow frustrated. He had expected her to crumble immediately, to freeze in terror or try to run, to do any of the things that his previous opponents had done when faced with his overwhelming power. Instead, she was making him work, making him chase her around the arena like a predator pursuing prey that refused to be caught. "Stand still and fight, human," he roared, his voice echoing off the dome above them as his frustration boiled over into Ragaseo. Yian did not respond. She simply kept moving, kept watching, kept waiting for the moment she needed. That moment came when Rakdos abandoned his technique entirely. His rage had taken over, and he began swinging wildly, putting all 4 arms into massive strikes that would pulverize anything they touched, but that left him unbalanced and overextend. Xiao Yian saw her opportunity. She allowed herself to be cornered against the arena wall, retreating until her back was nearly touching the solid surface behind her. With nowhere left to run, Rakdos grinned with savage triumph as he advanced, raising all 4 arms high above his head for a killing blow that would splatter her across the wall in that moment. His lower arms were exposed. The nerve clusters that Counselor Mireth had told her about completely unprotected as he prepared to end her life. Seo Yan move she pushed off the wall with every ounce of strength her human body possessed, diving forward rather than away, going under his raised arms rather than trying to escape to the side her. Knife found the nerve cluster behind his lower left arm first, sliding between the scales with surgical precision. Then she twisted, redirecting her momentum in a way that should have been impossible, and struck the nerve cluster behind his lower right arm before he could react. Rakthos screamed. It was a sound that no one in the arena had ever heard before. A sound of genuine pain and shock from a creature who had spent his entire life being invincible. His lower arms went completely limp, hanging uselessly at his sides as the paralysis took hold. The crowd was on their feet now, screaming and shouting in a dozen different languages, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. But Rakthos was not finished. Even with only 2 functional arms, he was still one of the most dangerous fighters in the galaxy, and his upper arms swung with desperate fury at the tiny human who had dared to hurt him. Seo Yan tried to dodge, but she had used everything she had in that last attack, and her reaction was a fraction of a second too slow. His upper right arm caught her across the ribs with a backhand blow that sent her flying across the arena. Like a doll thrown by an angry child, she hit the floor hard and skidded for several meters before coming to a stop in a crumpled heat. Pain exploded through her body as she felt her ribs crack from the impact, and blood began to flow from a wound on her side where his claws had torn through her uniform. The arena fell silent once again as both fighters lay on the ground, neither moving for a long moments. Seo Yan forced herself to breathe despite the agony, forced herself to push through the pain that screamed at her to stay down and accept defeat. She began to rise. The crowd watched in disbelief as the tiny human, blood streaming from her wound, struggled to her feet on shaking legs across the arena. Rakthos was also rising, his lower arms still useless, but his upper arms clenched into fists as rage replaced shock on his face. Now, he snarled with a voice that promised suffering beyond imagination. I will end you slowly. Seo Yan stood on legs that trembled with every heartbeat, and she could feel the broken ribs grinding against each other inside her chest with every breath. She forced herself to take. Blood was flowing steadily from the wound on her side, soaking through her uniform and dripping onto the gray arena floor in a trail of crimson drops that marked everywhere she had been. Medical alerts were flashing on the referee's display, showing her vital signs in urgent red as her body struggled to cope with the damage it had sustained. The Veloxian referee floated toward her with obvious concern, and the protocols were clear. When a fighter's vital signs reached critical levels, the referee had the authority to stop the match for their own safety. Cadet Yoon, the referee announced, your injuries are severe. I am prepared to call this match in the interest of your survival. Do you wish to continue? 50,000 spectators held their breath, waiting for her answer. Seo Yan looked at the referee, then looked across the arena at Rakthos, who was waiting with murder in his eyes. And then she did something that made the entire crowd gasp in unison. She waved the referee away. Under Academy law, she said through gritted teeth, a cadet has the right to refuse medical intervention during combat. I am refusing. The referee hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with allowing this broken human to continue fighting against an opponent who would surely kill her. But the law was the law. Very well, the Veloxian said, floating back to a safe distance. The match continues. Rakthos tilted his massive head to one side, studying her with an expression that had shifted from rage to something like confusion. Had killed many opponents in his long career, but none of them had ever chosen to continue fighting after being injured this badly. They had always surrendered or begged for mercy or simply collapsed and accepted their fate. But this human, This tiny creature from a planet he had never bothered to learn anything about was choosing to die on her feet rather than live on her knees. "Why do you continue?" he demanded, his voice echoing across the silent arena. "You cannot win. You cannot even hurt me anymore. Why do you choose to suffer when you could simply yield?" Seo Yeon took a step forward, and the movement cost her more than anyone watching could understand. But she refused to let the pain show on her face. "Let me tell you something about my species," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the arena despite the agony that burned through her body with every word. "We come from a planet that tried to kill us every single day of our existence. The ground shakes and swallows our cities. The sky opens up and drowns our homes. The very air we breathe can turn poisonous without warning. And yet we survived." She took another step forward, and blood continued to drip behind her. "We fought wars that killed millions of our own kind, and we survived. We faced diseases that wiped out half our population, and we survived. We endured famines and floods and fires and disasters that should have ended us 100 times over. And still we survived." Rakthos said nothing, but his eyes had narrowed as he listened to her words. "Do you want to know why we survived?" Seo Yeon continued, taking yet another step toward him. "Because humans do not know how to give up. It is not in our nature. We fight when there is no hope of winning. We keep going when every logical calculation says we should stop. We refuse to surrender, even when surrender is the only sensible option." She was close enough now that he could have reached out and crushed her skull with one blow. But he did not move. "That is what you are facing today," she said, looking up at him with eyes that held no fear. "Not a cadet, not a warrior, not even a soldier. You are facing a human, and humans do not fight because they think they will win. They fight because some things matter more than survival." Silence hung over the arena like a heavy blanket, and even the spectators who had come hoping to see her die were captivated by this moment. Rakthos finally moved, raising his functional upper arms into a fighting stance as feeling began to return to his lower limbs. "Pretty words," he growled, "but words will not save you. Nothing will save you now." He attacked, swinging his massive arm in a blow that would take her head off if it connected. Seo Yeon did not dodge. Instead, she stepped forward, directly into the path of his attack. And the crowd screamed as they watched what seemed like certain death approaching. But Rakthos hesitated. His arm stopped, hovering centimeters from her neck, frozen in mid-strike, as he stared at her with an expression no one had ever seen on the Corvani face before. She had not flinched. She was looking directly into his eyes with that same smirk she had worn when they first met. And there was no fear in her gaze, no desperation, no acceptance of death, only the calm certainty of someone who had made peace with whatever happened next. "Why?" Rakthos whispered, and his voice sounded almost broken. "Why do you not fear me?" Seoin's smirk softened into something that might have been compassion. "Because I understood something a long time ago," she replied. "Fear of death is the fear of the unknown. But I know exactly what I am. I know exactly what I stand for. And I know that even if you kill me today, you will never be able to say that I surrendered. You will never be able to say that humans are weak. You will remember me for the rest of your life. And so will everyone else who watched this fight." Rakthos the Unbroken, the most feared fighter in the galaxy, the predator who had never known what it meant to hesitate, lowered his arms, and then he did something that no one in the arena would have believed possible if they had not seen it with their own eyes. He dropped to one knee in Corvani culture. This was the ultimate gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that the person before you was not just an equal, but a superior, someone worthy of honor that transcended victory or defeat. "I yield," Rakthos said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not because I cannot kill you. I could still crush you with a single blow. I yield because you have shown me what true warriors are. I have fought for 47 years, and I have never met anyone who possessed what you possess. I yield because you have earned something that I cannot take from you. No matter how many times I could defeat you in combat. The arena erupted into chaos. Some spectators were cheering, others were crying, and many were simply staring in stunned silence as they tried to process what they had. Just witness the Corvani in attendance were on their feet. Not in anger, but in something that looked almost like reverence. Because their champion had just acknowledged a human, a tiny, broken, bleeding human, as his better Seo Yeon felt her legs finally give out beneath her. The adrenaline that had kept her standing fading now that the fight was over, she collapsed. But before she hit the ground, Rakdos caught her with his upper arms. Holding her gently despite the massive claws that could have torn her apart, medical teams rushed onto the arena floor, pushing hover stretchers and carrying equipment that beeped and flashed as they prepared to save her life. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, Rakdos caught her hand in his massive grip. "What are you?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine wonder. Seo Yeon, barely conscious and fading fast from blood loss, managed one final smile. "Human," she whispered, and then everything went dark. 3 weeks had passed since the match that changed everything, and Seo Yeon was finally well enough to sit up in her medical bed and receive visitors without the doctors worrying that she might collapse from the effort. The medical bay of Station Varus 7 had become the most famous location in the galaxy during her recovery, with news crews from dozens of worlds camping outside the doors and diplomats from various species sending messages requesting interviews or audiences with the human who had brought Rakdos the Unbroken to his knees. Footage of the match had spread across every network in known space within hours of its conclusion, and it had been viewed more times than any other recording in galactic history. Humans who had been dismissed as soft primitives from a backwater planet for the 5 years since they had made first contact with galactic civilization were suddenly being viewed in an entirely different light. The Galactic Council had formally requested a presentation on human capabilities, and Earth's ambassador, a woman named Dr. Kim Yoon-hai, who had spent years being politely ignored at diplomatic functions, found herself suddenly fielding hundreds of inquiries about military alliances and trade partnerships, species that had never bothered to learn the name of humanity's homeworld were now studying human history with intense fascination, trying to understand how such physically unremarkable creatures had developed such an apparently indomitable spirit. On the 14th day of her recovery, Seo Yeon received a visitor she had not expected. Rakdos entered the medical bay with a grace that seemed impossible for someone of his size, and he carried something wrapped in ceremonial cloth under his upper right arm. The medical staff tensed when they saw him, instinctively afraid of the predator who had put their patient in this bed. But Seo Yeon waved them away with a weak gesture. "I hope you are recovering well," Rakdos said, and there was gentleness in his voice that would have shocked anyone who had known him before. The macho Yeon managed a small smile despite the bandages that still wrapped most of her torso. "The doctors say I will make a full recovery in another month," she replied. "They seem surprised by how fast I am healing. Apparently humans are more resilient than they expected." Rakdos made a sound that might have been laughter. "Of course you are," he said. "I should have known that even your bodies would refuse to accept defeat." He sat down in the chair beside her bed, which creaked ominously under his weight but held firm, and he placed the wrapped object on his lap. "I came to give you something," he said, "and to tell you something that I have never told anyone." Seo Yeon waited, curious about what could bring the galaxy's most feared warrior to her bedside with such an uncharacteristically humble demeanor. "I've been fighting since I was old enough to hold a weapon," Rakdos began. "And in all that time, I believed that strength was everything. I believed that the measure of a warrior was their ability to destroy their opponents. I believed that power was the only thing that mattered in this universe. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. You showed me that I was wrong. You showed me that there is something more important than power, something that cannot be measured in victories or kills. You showed me that true strength is not about how hard you can hit. It is about how much you can endure and still refuse to break. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal his war axe. The same weapon he had wielded against her in the arena. The blade that had cracked the floor and nearly ended her life. In Corvani culture, when one warrior recognizes another as their equal or their superior, they give them their weapon as a sign of that recognition. This axe has been in my family for 12 generations, and it has never been given to an outsider. He held it out to her, and despite its massive size, he placed it gently on the bed beside her. Until now, Seo Yeon stared at the weapon, understanding the magnitude of what he was offering, and she felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. I do not know if I can even lift this, she admitted. Rako smiled. A genuine smile that transformed his predator face into something almost warm. You lifted something far heavier in that arena, he said. You lifted the spirits of your entire species. You lifted my understanding of what it means to be a warrior. A few kilograms of metal should be easy after that. He stood and turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he looked back one final time. I will be returning to Corvin Prime tomorrow, he said. And I will tell my people what I witnessed here. I will tell them that humans are not the weak creatures we believe them to be. I will tell them that when they meet a human, they should treat them with the same respect they would show any Corvani warrior. And then he was gone, leaving Seo Yeon alone with an ancient weapon, and the knowledge that she had changed the course of galactic history. The Academy was transformed in the weeks that followed. Human cadets were no longer mocked or looked down upon. Instead, they were treated with a cautious respect that bordered on reverence. The next enrollment cycle saw 12 human applicants, where there had only been 7 the year before. And the cycle after that saw 50 within 5 years. Humans had become known as the galaxy's most determined warriors, not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most technologically advanced, but the ones who simply would not quit no matter what they faced. Species that had once dismissed humanity began actively seeking human officers for their most difficult missions, knowing that a human would keep fighting long after any other species would have surrendered. Councilor Mirith, the Dazari who had given Seo Yeon the knowledge she needed to survive, was never punished for sharing forbidden information. In fact, the Galactic Council quietly awarded them a commendation for contributing to interspecies understanding that everyone knew was really a thank you for helping create the legend. Park Jin-woo and the other human cadets who had helped Seo Yeon train all graduated with honors, and several of them went on to become the first human instructors at the Academy, teaching new generations of warriors, human and alien alike, what it truly meant to be brave. And Seo Yeon herself. 20 years after the match that changed everything, Admiral Yoon Seo Yeon stood on the bridge of the HSS Perseverance, the first human flagship in the United Earth Fleet, looking out at the stars through a viewport that stretched from floor to ceiling. The Corvani war axe hung on the wall of her ready room, a reminder of the moment that had defined her life and the lives of billions of humans who came after her. Young Cadet approached her, nervous to be in the presence of a living legend, and asked the question that Seo Yeon had been asked thousands of times in the years since that day in the arena. Admiral, what was it like facing Rakthos the Unbroken? How did you find the courage to stand against him when everyone said it was impossible? Seo Yeon turned from the viewport and looked at the young cadet with eyes that had seen more battles and more wonders than most humans could imagine. I was not the strongest, She said, "I was not the fastest. I was not the smartest or the most skilled. I was just human, and humans do not know how to give up. It is not a decision we make. It is simply who we are." The cadet nodded, trying to absorb the weight of those words. Seo-Yum looked back out at the stars. The same stars her grandmother had once looked at from a war-torn village in Korea, dreaming of a future where her descendants would not have to fight just to survive. That dream had come true in ways her grandmother could never have imagined. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy through force or technology or any of the things that other species valued. They had earned their place through something far simpler and far more powerful. They had earned it through the stubborn, unbreakable refusal to be afraid. And somewhere across the galaxy, on a harsh world where warriors were forged in endless battle, an elderly Kovani, who had once been called the Unbroken, told his grandchildren the story of the tiny human who had taught him what true strength really meant. Never underestimate a human, he would say at the end of every telling. They are the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy, not because of what they can do, but because of what they refuse to stop doing. And his grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, wondering if they would ever meet one of these legendary humans for themselves. The stars continued to burn in the endless dark, and humanity continued to reach for them, one impossible challenge at a time, because that was simply what humans did.